so much for joining us today. We are really delighted to have Christopher Stevens with us to speak about his book, The Light of Day, which he co-authored with Louise Radnowski. My name is Clem. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Birmingham. I'm in my write-up year, so very happy to be away from my desk and here today instead. And Christopher is an academic and an author based in southwest London. And The Light of Day is a book about your relationship with Roger Butler, who you met when you were 21. You became a reader for Roger as he was just around 30 years old. And Roger did something very important as part of the gay liberation movement. Roger wrote to UK newspapers declaring himself publicly to be a homosexual as part of the fight for gay liberation before it was decriminalised in the UK. So The Light of Day is an account about Roger's life and his activism, and really it gets to the heart of an untold story that hasn't been shared until the publication of this book. If you've not had a chance to read Christopher's book yet, there'll be a chance to buy copies after this talk, and also there'll be a chance to ask your own questions to Christopher after this section. So I wanted to start by talking about Roger's letter. Roger wrote to newspapers in the UK in 1960, and that was 7 years before homosexuality was decriminalised in the UK. So I wondered if you could share the context of the risk that Roger took and the significance of the impact it had on activism.
Yeah, of course. So you have to go back to 1885, really, to tell that story. In 1885, an amendment was put onto a law which became known as the Labouchere Amendment, named after the man who put it in there. This was a law that was being put in place to protect women and girls against sexual violence, raising the age of consent from 13 to 16, shockingly. And they just sort of threw in this extra bit quite last minute, defining any sexual act between two men, and it was just men, as gross indecency, and gross indecency was made a criminal act, punishment of imprisonment, hard labour potentially for 2 years. That stays on the books, and come the 1950s, Roger, who really sort of discovers that he's a gay man by reading a book by another gay man who had been sent to prison because of that law in the early 1950s. Roger reads his book in 1957, discovers that is what he is. He gets involved in the homosexual law reform society. In the 1950s, that law, that 19th century law, isn't just something that's sort of archaic in the background, no one really pays any attention to it. And it's not even like, there was a conference last week about Section 28, it's not even like that, which is a law that sort of wasn't, no one was ever criminalised under it. It created an atmosphere, but it didn't do anything to people. This law really did do things to people. There are letters written at the time, again and again and again in the 1950s, to the newspapers, to the various periodicals, and the political periodicals setting out the damage that this was doing, because the police were actively going into communities and searching out people to prosecute. Some of those letters describe a really alarming approach of trying to find vulnerable people, or trying to find people who might identify as vulnerable people even. So going into a place and saying, who do you know who we might be able to? Picking on them, getting names, going around the place, and then collecting up groups and groups, promising those first people, well, we probably won't do anything to you, it's too serious if you give us some names. It starts to sound like a sort of communist Russia type thing, you know, tell on your neighbour. Those letters not only describe, and we picked a few to put in the book, not only describe that process for the people who were persecuted under the law, but they describe what that led to in terms of how people reacted as individuals to seeing this stuff going on around them. And so death by suicide was was hugely prevalent during this period. And there are stories of couples, same-sex couples who have been together, living together perhaps for decades, who see that this is going on in their town, their village, fingers are being pointed in their direction, and they can see the writing on the wall, and they go into their garage and they gas themselves. This kind of stuff, just extraordinarily painful things to read. The other side of it is that public opinion is very largely in favour of this law being implemented. So this isn't something against which there's huge public outcry left, right and centre. And so you read in the newspapers at the time all kinds of language being used about gay people, which perhaps we see used about other people these days. We may want to talk about that later on, but these are people who are going in to try to corrupt your children. These are people who are infiltrating our national institutions, trying to bring down society. If we don't do something about it, they will do something to us. So there's a threat there which is being presented to as wide a readership as many of these newspapers had. And of course in the 1950s, 1960s, there isn't social media and not everyone has a television, so the newspapers really are a place where you'll get your news. So there's a legal political atmosphere and there's a social atmosphere, and altogether that creates almost complete silence from gay people, gay men at least, because they are rightfully totally scared of what might happen. There's a very famous case in 1954, the Montague affair, which many people would have heard of. And that's what triggered the government first to commission some work about whether or not this law should be repealed. The charges against the three men who were sent to prison for this indecency included conspiracy to do this. So the law wasn't just we have evidence that you engaged in a sexual act and therefore we're sending you to prison for breaking the law in that sense. Conspiracy to do this. So writing love letters or being seen to be going to a place where other people might be going for the same reason as you. Those things were all being criminalised as a sort of slippery slope. And so writing a letter, as Roger does in 1960, when all of this is still very much in place, saying, I am one of those people. So Roger's letter starts with the words, we are homosexuals, and there are three people who sign it at the end, Roger's name being the first, are putting themselves at great risk of being criminalised. Now they don't say, by the way, we had sex last Tuesday, and therefore putting themselves at risk of being prosecuted for that, but the conspiracy part of it, yeah, for sure. And really, really difficult environment for anyone to function as a gay man, but if you are of the mind that you want to participate in changing the law, how do you do that then? How do you put yourself out there? You can't go out with a placard on the streets because you'll just be arrested. That's a crime. So Roger found that it was increasingly frustrating that as a gay man, and as he got to know gay society, albeit a hidden gay society, got involved in the law reform movement, all the voices that were out there arguing for law reform were straight people. Or they were gay people using a pseudonym, or hiding or being totally anonymous. And so this act of declaring who you are and what you are is totally new. Something Roger regretted no one else had done by that stage. He really wanted someone famous to do it. He writes over and over again in lots of his letters, I wish Ian Forster had done it, I wish Noel Coward had done it, I wish someone had done it whose name would mean more than Roger Butler, because no one's ever heard of me. But no one else was willing to do it, and so he did. You asked about impacts. I mean, in terms of that, I think that there are really two things. One is that the discourse for the first time is being claimed by the people who are impacted by this law. So this letter by saying, we are homosexuals, we are individual people, we're like you, we're not trying to undermine society, we just want to live our own lives, which is sort of a crazy version of the content. Roger is humanising what gay people are and normalising it to a degree, but he's also then taking the narrative and saying we aren't idiots. It's not a patronising, oh, those people over there are, they're not so bad, don't worry about it. Saying this is who we are, this is what we are, and we are claiming our space within society, and you shouldn't be scared of us. And so for the first time, that's the narrative that is being expanded in a public space voluntarily by people with the explicit intention of trying to change the law. And it's listened to. And I think that's a really important feature of the impact of this. So not only do you see for several months in the newspapers where the letter is published, people talking about it, people reflecting on aspects of it and then going off into different discourses, as people did in letter pages in those days. But within a couple of weeks, Roger is invited to go and be part of a panel at a newspaper that doesn't exist anymore. It's a precursor to the Sunday Mirror, which in the earlier 1950s had been really well known for a series of stories about gay men, the title for which was Evil Men. And all of those fear-mongering statements about gay people were very much being pushed by this paper. Really, they used the phrase in that earlier stuff, a final solution to this problem, and how emotive is that. For the first time after this letter is written, actual gay people are invited to come and talk to the newspaper, to a reporter, to be in a space and to tell their side of the story. And that might seem to us now like obvious and logical and not really that big a deal, but actually in 1960 that's major, really, really major. And so there's an ecosystem in terms of how the law changes, but in terms of shifting things in the right kind of direction and towards, I think, what those of us who have studied social movements would see as how progress from below as well as progress from above. That's definitely shifting things and helping the big picture to move.
I think that really puts into context how terrifying and vulnerable it must have been for Roger to send that letter, but also putting into perspective the momentum that it caused. So you mentioned about how Roger wished that someone else had done it because no one's ever heard of Roger Butler, and I went to a bit before I read this book, I hadn't heard of Roger Butler. And so I was wondering, what factors do you think have led to this story being largely forgotten? And in particular, Roger experienced prejudice as a result of being a gay man, but also due to his blindness. Do you think his disability impacted the erasure of his story?
Short answer, yes, certainly. I think there are a few factors, and I'll come to Roger's site at the end. The first is that Roger was quite a shy person. He didn't claim much for himself. He, I think, didn't quite realise the significance of what he had done. He was a young man. He talks about what he did later on as youthful bravado. And he himself actually never read the letter again after he sent it. He kept copies of every single letter he's written in his life. He had long correspondences with people and would keep his letter and their letter, and for years and years and years. But this letter was missing. So that there's a bit of who Roger was, what his character was, about not claiming something huge, I think. Another factor is that the gay rights movement changes. So the early Homosexual Law Reform Society, which is what Roger joined, was a pressure group to try to get the government's own recommendations about repealing the law against homosexuality enforced. So the committee that was set up to look at this recommends that the law should be changed, that homosexuality should be decriminalised partially, but nothing happens about it. I would say, because politicians were just a bit too nervous of being the one to say yes effectively. So it didn't generate much movement. So what Roger got involved in was that really early, from 1958, a really early reform movement that was saying we want these changes to be put in place. We just want to be treated like everybody else. And that's the line of Roger's letter, treat us like everybody else. Come 1970, so a few years after the law has changed, and the Gay Liberation Front emerges, and the whole ethos is different. Basically, the GLF is a campaigning, a very, very, very cool campaigning movement. They are out there with placards, they are wearing badges, and they're saying we need to smash apart society and rebuild it so that it's no longer homophobic, but also no longer racist, no longer misogynist, all of the things. Let's intersect with other marginalised groups and make this a better society. And probably to do that, we need to, if not completely tear down the structures of that society, they need to radically shift too. And so reformers like Roger, people in the 1950s who were quietly writing letters and saying, please just give us some rights, were deemed to be not really what we wanted anymore in terms of the GLF. And you find a bit of infighting, and queer liberation post the change in the law is definitely characterised by infighting of people in the GLF labelling the earlier reforms as straight gays. That's the phrase they use. And again, I learned this last week that people were using that phrase in the 1980s, actually, in the 90s, around Section 28 issues. So gay people who were sort of living their lives quietly, as if they were straight people, were not trying to upset the cards. Whereas the gay rights movement in the early 1970s is definitely trying to upset the cards. So I think a lot of that gets, of what was happening in the early period gets sort of pushed aside slightly in the grand narratives around change. But then the third is absolutely what uses his site. So 1960, when he writes the letter, is also the year that Roger first experiences in his adult life a significant shift in his vision. From birth, he had a problem. He was operated on when he was 2 years old to save his sight, which they achieved. But he was always, well, he felt, he knew he would always lose his sight at a certain point. And by 1965, he's lost the sight in his left eye. By 1966, he's lost the sight in his right eye. And so Roger's life, really from the early 1960s, becomes how do I adapt to survive within society? A society which really doesn't do much for disabled people, actually, to try to help the lives of disabled people to flourish in whatever ways might be possible for them. It's painful to read what Roger goes through, not just how he's treated in hospital, which is nasty, really nasty. There are some lovely people along the way that he experiences, but in both times he loses the sight in his eyes. His experiences waking up after an operation with a patch over the eye that's been operated on, the doctor lifts it, he sees nothing, the doctor effectively sort of grunts and moves on, and that's him being told by the blind now. I'm sure healthcare has shifted radically since the 1960s on that front, but that was the starting point for Roger, who then is effectively told, well, all you can hope to be is a lesser version of what you have been. And in order to do that, you need to try to hold on to all the bits of your life that you are able to hold on to by any means possible. And so keep your job if you possibly can, if not get another job, any job they will give you, because of course you don't deserve to have ambition, you just deserve maybe to be employed usefully in society. Those kinds of attitudes. And as Roger was experiencing those problems in the lead up to the loss of sight, and then after he loses his sight completely in 1966, of course his time, effort, energy, and even his ability to get to places where he might continue to be involved in activism and frankly continue to have gay friends is almost zero at that point. Just staying awake long enough because he's so exhausted from getting to work in the morning and getting back from his job. So Roger effectively starts fighting another battle at that stage. So when the law changes in 1967, there's a big party in January 1968 that he's invited to as one of the people who was involved in this. You know, all of the big names are there, and he's sitting on a sofa with his guide dog, kind of having to wait for people to come and approach him and talk to him because he isn't able to function in that space in the way that he would and should be able to. Yeah, so it's a hugely defining thing for him in that decade.
I'm glad that Roger's story could be told also now.
Me too.
You mentioned about inequality in the community, in the LGBTQ community, maybe between different styles of activism, different generations. But to focus on the positive aspects of interaction between different generations, the book really captures your close friendship relationship with Roger. And there's parts where there are collections of Roger's letters where he describes his own idols, or people that he wrote to that were older than him, gay men, that helped inspire his journey. Do you feel that there are parallels between Roger and his own mentor figures and your relationship with Roger? And what do you think the importance is of having intergenerational mentors for LGBTQ people?
Yeah, absolutely. The more that I read and wrote of Roger's letters, so for those of you who haven't read any of it, Roger left me his archive of papers, so I have everything that was in his house that he had written or received and stored, which was most of it, so boxes and boxes of stuff. The more that I read of his correspondence, particularly with a man called Lionel Fielden, who features in the book quite heavily, he was born right at the beginning of the 20th century and told the story of sitting on the knee of Queen Victoria. He's very proud of that. Upper-class Englishman who was living out in the countryside in Tuscany with his much younger Italian boyfriend. He writes to Roger when he sees the letter having been published in the New Statesman. And they begin a 14-year letter correspondence. They actually only meet 3 times during that period. But it becomes a mentorship for Roger, absolutely, in a whole variety of ways, not just around the question of homosexuality, of how to change the law initially, because it starts in 1960, but then also how to live as a gay person. So all of these questions that between the two of them, they thrash out, and they have quite different perspectives on this stuff. They're a big age gap. And Lionel is horrified at some of the things that Roger describes about getting to the secret gay pubs and meetings. He hates the idea of meetings because that seems like social unrest, and for him, the structures of society need to be unthreatened in order for things to change, for sympathy to be given to a particular group. But he also, through that lens, I think, then starts to become Roger's mentor around how to live as well, more broadly. He models for Roger. Roger goes to visit him a couple of years after that first letter. Is wowed by this amazing villa on the side of a hill in Italy. She went to visit a few years ago actually, and I was wowed by it as well. It's extraordinary. He sees a different way of living, not just wealthy, but one which focused on, I think, a sense of developing who you are rather than what you can be for the world. So, Lionel encouraged Roger to think about what he was passionate about and what was he interested in the arts. What did he want to be? What did he want to contribute, as opposed to what job you're going to have? Should you carry on being the estate agent that he was when he went to London for the first time? And expanded his horizons, I think, in a way which Roger felt very much his parents and none of the older generation, apart from one older lesbian aunt who clearly tries to encourage a young Roger in the right direction. It just feels that that's missing. That was missing from all of his youth. School wasn't for him because he just didn't see anything like him, and he didn't read anything about people like him. And my relationship to Roger is different from that, because when I saw queer representation in the media. It wasn't always positive, but I saw it, so I knew what I was. I didn't have to be told that by anybody at the age of 20, whatever, but there's a mentorship that grew up through that common connection as well, I think. One of the really fascinating things about 1950s, particularly London, gay bars, gay pubs and clubs that existed, and there are probably more in Soho then than there are now, is that the people who go to them describe being there as a space in which social barriers are pulled down because you have this common denominator, and in those days a criminalised one. So Roger describes being surrounded by people of different nationalities, of faiths, rich people, poor people, sailors, always a sailor, someone in a uniform by a bar, and celebrities that he's seen on TV before, people that he would never see if he were a straight person going into the kind of bar or pub or whatever he might have gone into, because there's this common connection. And I think on a smaller scale, I have experienced that with Roger and with some other people, that there's the sort of the unsaid thing is kind of implicitly said from the start, and so you know that you will have some things in common as a starting point, not everything in common, of course, but that allows you then perhaps to develop that kind of mentorship relationship with someone who's older. And I think it goes both ways. My experience, certainly from reading Roger's correspondence and hopefully my relationship to Roger, it's not just a younger person who's being told how life could be or how life should be, or having their eyes opened to new horizons. It works the other way around. And you can see in Roger's correspondence with Lionel that Roger is also chipping away at some of Lionel's stereotypes or some of his prejudices about what world is or what world could be. So yeah, I hope that's the future of it. And I think it's a really important thing for anybody, frankly, but certainly for queer people, and certainly if you've grown up in an environment where you perhaps haven't had that, not just support, because I had really lovely supportive parents, but experience, I suppose. People with experience who can empathise with you and say, I get it.
We've developed a network in the Careers Network at the University of Birmingham. It's a LGBTQ mentorship scheme where we pair up students with people in business so they can, like you said, learn from each other through conversation about navigating through careers as an LGBTQ person. And I'm also conscious that this event is taking place as part of LGBTQ History Month. You mentioned that when Roger was in school, he felt school wasn't for him. And quite a large part of the book talks about your experiences with academia and Roger's experiences at university. So how do you think academic institutions have changed over time? And are there any problems that you think are parallel today?
Plenty, I'd say. And my experience was, well, Roger went to university late, so I think as a young person I had a different kind of experience to him. So he went straight to the working world and then comes back into higher education in 1970 after using his sight. For him though, going into that context, even though it turns out many of the people that he met there I think would have been extremely supportive of him, it was still very much not spoken about. And so people have asked questions having read the book, did Roger's friends know what he had done? Did they even know kind of what he was? And to a degree, I think no is the answer to that question for many of them. Roger loved being at university. He loved the social side of being at university. He had loads of friends, he loved doing lots of things, but homosexuality wasn't really on the calendar necessarily. When I went to university, I went to Freshers' Fair, and there was, in those days, I'm afraid, LGBT Society, but it was there. And actually, I signed up in Freshers' Fair, and within a week I got a letter from someone who was in my college in the year above saying, you signed up to this thing, we'd love you to come to this tea party Sunday, we're all going from there to this bar to this thing. And so I kind of had my hand held through that, actually, in a way which was extraordinary for me, because I grew up under Section 28 at school, and so it wasn't spoken about. It was on TV, so I knew all this stuff, but even in a sort of clinical sex ed environment, homosexuality wasn't spoken about. It was hush-hush. And so for me, going to university was a radical change, a kind of breath of fresh air, and suddenly I could be this thing, I could live out this thing I had known that I was for a long time. It's not the opposite for Roger, I suppose, but he's done his London experience and then goes back into education, having lost his sight, and so his world having contracted a lot. The big difference, I think, in terms of university, when I went to university certainly, but now, particularly in Roger's experience, is around how students with disabilities are treated, I think. So, LGBT people in general don't come to university with learning needs because they are LGBT. Some people will, and there are intersections, of course. But a blind person, a person who cannot see, has some very obvious needs in terms of accessing written material, getting to lectures, those sorts of things, which, working in university now as I do, I know we're incredibly conscious of both what we can do and what we can't do for people with disabilities, whatever those disabilities might be, whether they're physical or otherwise. And Roger had an interview to go to university where the starting point was, oh, you don't want to do history, do you? You should do law, because blind people, they're better at that. There are some books in that. You know, that's the starting point. Again, the starting point is such a low bar, which says, no, I want to do history, I'm going to do the thing I want to do. But no provision is made for him. You know, there are no books in Braille. The audiobooks are just ones you can get from the public library. There's obviously no computers in those days. It's just so inaccessible. And come the end of his second term, he's asked to do some exams about what he's learned, which he can touch type because he's been taught that previously, but he doesn't know any answers to any of the questions because he just hasn't been given any material that would help him learn. It's a horrible situation, and the college's answer to that is, do you want to leave? And that's it. So it takes a very, very good person. One of Roger's tutors in his third term, because Roger refuses to leave, he stayed to help him work out a system where he gets individual people to sign up to come and read books to him in his room, hour by hour, which is the tradition he carries on for the rest of his life. He has, on his desk in his room in college, he has a big piece of paper with days of the week and hours of the day that you can just sort of sign up and say, if you come in for a drink with Roger, you kind of also need to volunteer. And I would be horrified if any of that were to happen to any disabled student now in any university. I fear that some people probably experience levels of prejudice and challenge, which they shouldn't, but that degree of it is extraordinary to encounter.
So, as an English literature student, I can't not ask, you mentioned a few times that you had media representations that weren't always positive, but they were there. And you mentioned in the book that Roger discovered that he was gay after he read pamphlets that revealed him who he was just by chance. He found it in Charing Cross. And then your own book you've dedicated to anyone who's ever walked up to a bookshelf looking for something that would change their life. So with all that, what do you think the value is of representation of gay people in both media but also in history?
would say essential. I think if you just look at things now around trans identities, you can see the danger in caricatures of groups of people, in terms of how that then becomes a dominant discourse. The same might be true of migrants, it might be true of other groups, but if we're talking about LGBT people, I think we see that now. Go and look at the stuff that Roger was reading when he was, the newspaper stories about gay people. You get this huge sweeping characterization, which, and the agenda of that is set by the media. It's set by people who have an axe to grind often, and people who want either to promote themselves or to harm people as opposed to that. So what Roger's letter models, I think, is something which I still believe is incredibly important, which is that people claiming a space in the world, claiming rights in society, need to be doing that for themselves. Yes, they need support, they need allyship, but they need to be doing it for themselves, they need to be enabled to do that for themselves, and their stories need to be the ones that are told. And I would say plural stories, because we all have our own stories, we all have our own sense of what claimed identity might be. And the more of those we hear, the more kids there'll be in schools or wherever saying, oh, okay, that's what I am, and it's all right. There's something out there, and maybe it gets better thing. I think hugely matters in terms of people growing up not either having a weird dysfunctional view of what they are or hating who they are, and then allowing themselves to flourish in all the other ways that they might do as a human being. I think storytelling is hugely important as part of that. So it's not just representation, there's a gay person over there, it's them being able to tell their story of what it means to be that thing, and to show that they are all of these other things too, and that they are successful or not in all of these things that they might be trying to achieve. And you only get to that point after some basic rights are given to you, which was Roger's role in that. You can only be the GLF asking for the society to be smashed down and to, for polyamory to be fine and those sorts of things, if you've got the right to exist as a starting point. So and that only is possible when representation is there for you to see. In Roger's case, that you have the word to know what you are, to put a label to it is important. And I know there's a lot of conversations, and I have them myself, where people are kind of anti-using labels. Labeling something isn't always seen as a positive thing, but unless something's got a name, it doesn't exist, I think. Certainly in terms of lawmaking, it doesn't exist. And so I think you need the person there, and you need to put the label on them in order for things to progress. So you can get through that basic phase of saying, okay, society allows you to be, now what else can you do, what else can you say, how can you flourish?
Thank you. That was a big question.
Try.
So before we open it up to audience questions, I'll ask one more thing, which is, what would you like people to take away from reading this book? What lessons do you think people can learn about activism going forward?
Lessons. I'd say the lesson Roger wanted people to receive from his lesson was that there are other people out there like you, and it's okay. I mean, that if this book does that for anybody, then I'm over the moon. I would like people to recognise that rights are fragile, that they are hard fought, and I think to touch on a question about activism, that they are not just won by the politician of the day or by the celebrity who takes something on as a cause, that there are almost always in social movements a bunch of people sitting in a town hall or someone's living room or whatever, stuffing envelopes, writing letters, signing cards, answering questions on the end of the telephone line, whatever the technology of that period might be, doing the day-to-day hard graft of activism. Activism isn't just what you see, it's this huge infrastructure that sits behind any successful activist movements. And those people's names are often not known, they're perhaps not even recorded anywhere at all. And the more that we can discover about that, I think the more that we might learn about how we can participate in the social movements that we might want to be a part of, and also hopefully counter any trends there might be or currents to pull back on those rights. And Roger was working in what's probably the worst decade to be a gay man in this country. You know, it really was terrible, and he managed to do this amazing thing just out of his living room intuition. So, you know, if he can do that, then we can do amazing things too.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Oh, amazing.
One question here.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask a big difference between when Roger writing now, so we now access the media, that kind of thing. So in terms of activism and community building and advocacy, how do you feel that changes the landscape of your work that needs doing and how you do it?
I mean, big time, obviously. When Roger started his work with the Homosexual Law Reform Society, he had to find on the back pages classified ads of a newspaper, a little advert to say get involved. There's a little address at the bottom. He had to put a letter in the post. He was called up by the person. He had to make his way to a house he'd never been to before. Step inside a home in an environment where this could have been a trap for all he knew. So it was a much smaller world, I suppose, in those days. Activism now, I think, in some ways can start off in a more open, safer kind of way for people to sort of view it from the sidelines. You can just look at the pictures of what such and such a movement is doing, you can scrutinise. But there's also an increased risk, I suppose, too, that people know what's going on, people from far and wide know what's going on, and I'm saying I've just been to the States, and there are groups there who make a point of following what certain other groups are doing so that they can go and attack them or picket them or whatever it might be. And so the risks are different, but I'm not sure that they're any better or worse. It's a much more complex environment in which to function. That said, if you've got a phone, you can start a movement now in a way that I think it was really hard for the law reform movement in the 1950s to get going. It took a really high-profile case, splashed all over the press, with a member of the aristocracy's name attached to it before the government even took any notice about something. It then takes another decade before anyone is taking any action to affect the recommendations of the report. And that in part, not exclusively of course, but in part is because the movements that are there to try to egg things on start off with these tiny little adverts at the back of printed newspaper that you may or may not buy, you may or may not see. So gathering your activists, I think, was a much harder challenge. There's stuff in there as well about anonymity, I think, which is very different now. It was, in some ways, easier to be anonymous in those days because you could write an anonymous letter and get your own, but in other ways harder because how do you affect something? How do you publicly achieve something if you are physically there? Whereas now there's probably better ways that you do things and participate if you yourself don't want to be seen in certain movements. Yeah, sorry, that probably doesn't answer your question, but I think it's the whole is good.
Thanks for really you talked in response to an ultimate question about the importance of words I was curious whether, those terms are just like very highly loaded on what they mean for things. So I just wondered, like, do you think that Roger's story makes more sense? Does it make more sense to conceive of this as a gay story or a queer one? Is there a difference, and does it matter?
I think Roger's story, I would say, is both, because that's the language he would have used. So he uses queer, homosexual, gay, later on, as synonymous in what he writes. That has obviously shifted, though that is quite recent, and Pete talking about it, I had such a nice time at this the Section 28 conference I was at last week, because the people sitting on that panel were using gay rights as an inclusive term, because in the 90s it was too, and I guess I'm a product of the 90s myself. I think it's important to know the nuance, but I would also myself say it's important not to place motive upon people's use of words before scrutinising why they're using those words in those words. I have friends who find queer offensive as a term because they were gay growing up in probably the 80s, 90s, and queer was the word that was used to bash them. And so I've had interesting exchanges with good friends who are very, very close with me and say that they don't feel that word should be used. So it's hugely complex, and I'm no expert on it. I would use Roger's words to describe Roger's story. I would use my words to describe mine, but I would encourage every person to use their own words, as long as we're sympathetic towards one another when we don't necessarily get it right. One of the challenges we had in writing the book was how to use the correct language around disabilities, actually. And I found it harder because I haven't had to engage with that particularly in my life. And so disabled people with disabilities, blind even as a word. The blind is something that you get littered through the literature from the 1960s. This group, the blind, as if they're all the same, is a really hard thing for people to extract themselves from using. The important thing, I think, is the intention behind it and people's willingness to listen and reflect.
Yeah. Thanks, Clem and Christopher. That was a really interesting talk. My question is just, what was your favourite memory of your time that you spent with Roger, Christopher?
My favourite memories of Roger are all in his home. He had a home that he loved, which he bought after he lost his sight, and so with a friend he had curated it really and turned it into a space which was not just visually beautiful, which it was, but had a peace to it, a calm. And for the first chunk of time that I knew Roger, I was a student and a really busy student, and my life was not calm. And so I think my fondest memories, as I think back of them, would be those really early times when I was experiencing that environment, seeing him being completely content and comfortable in it, and loving showing it to someone who was proud of it. One of the symptoms of Roger's loss of sight was that he struggled to leave his home in later life. He did get a guide dog for a while, but he was never comfortable with a guide dog. He learned to use a stick, but he always felt extremely vulnerable. So he would only really leave the house with another person, and as he got older, his circle diminished. So his home really was his haven. It was his safe space, and to be able to share that